The paint racks are gone now. Inside the abandoned factory, the silence feels heavier than the machinery ever did. Dust clings to cracked floors where forklifts once rattled past pallets of enamel bottles and boxed model kits bound for hobby shops across America. Faded safety lines still cut across the concrete. Rust creeps through old pipes overhead. In one corner, a forgotten color chart hangs crooked on the wall, its tiny squares still carrying names once memorized by generations of builders who could identify a Mustang, a Messerschmitt, or a Phantom jet before they were old enough to drive. For decades, this place helped teach people how to build something slowly. Not virtually. Not instantly. By hand. A bottle of Testors paint was never just paint. It sat beside scattered instruction sheets, bent tweezers, tiny decals floating in shallow water, and half-finished airplanes drying on kitchen tables under yellow light. The smell of enamel and glue drifted through garages, basements, classrooms, and hobby shops in thousands of American towns. Children learn patience here. Precision. Trial and error. Sometimes history itself. And then, almost quietly, that world began to disappear. Not all at once. Not through one catastrophic collapse or one fatal decision. The shelves simply started shrinking. Hobby shops closed. Fewer kids walked through the doors. New entertainment moved faster, demanded less patience, and arrived glowing through television screens, game consoles, and eventually phones small enough to fit in a pocket. The culture surrounding model building began to thin out long before most people noticed what was happening. Testors' model empire ended as shifting consumer interests, rising production pressures, and intensified competition drained its dominance. Once beloved for hobby paints and model kits, the company struggled to stay profitable while adapting to a changing market where new toys and electronics grabbed attention faster. Inside the abandoned factory, the silence shows how quickly a creative American legacy can fade when demand disappears and the business cannot reinvent fast enough. That is what makes this story larger than one company. Because this factory did not only produce paint bottles and model kits. It belonged to an older American rhythm, one built around repair, patience, technical curiosity, and the quiet satisfaction of making something with your own hands. The decline of Testors was also the decline of a certain kind of childhood, a certain kind of learning, and a certain belief that skill was worth developing slowly. Today, more than 2,000 hobby shops across the United States are gone. Entire aisles once devoted to model building have vanished from major retailers. The little square bottle that once sat on nearly every workbench survives mostly as memory, collector nostalgia, or leftover stock buried deep inside aging stores that still smell faintly of lacquer and cardboard. But the strangest part is this. The empire did not look weak when the decline truly began. From the outside, Testors still looked familiar. The logo remained. The paint bottles remained. The kits remained. Yet underneath the surface, the world that had sustained the company for generations was already changing faster than the factory could follow. What happened here was not just the story of a brand losing relevance. It was the story of an American hobby culture slowly losing the world that made it possible. And to understand how an empire built on imagination, craftsmanship, and tiny painted airplanes ended in silence, you have to go back to the beginning. Back before the hobby shops. Before the model kits. Before the square bottles became icons of American childhood. Back to a small glue company in Rockford, Illinois, where none of this looked inevitable yet. The glue that started an empire. Long before the factory went quiet, before the paint racks emptied and the model aisle began to disappear from American life, the whole story rested on something small enough to fit in a kitchen drawer. A bottle of glue. That was the beginning. Not a grand headquarters. Not a national hobby empire. Not rows of enamel paints waiting under store lights. Just a practical adhesive in Rockford, Illinois, made for families who still believed broken things were worth saving. A loose shoe sole. A cracked toy. A school project coming apart the night before it was due. A piece of household life that needed one more chance before it was thrown away. In 1929, Niels F. Testor bought the assets of a small Rockford adhesive business, and with that modest decision, A name that would later sit on thousands of hobby shelves began its slow climb into American memory. At the time, it did not look historic. It looked ordinary. A Swedish immigrant stepping into a small trade, selling a product that had to prove itself the hard way, by working when people needed it. That mattered more than it sounds. America was moving into hard years. Families watched their money closely. Waste carried a different meaning. A bottle of glue was not a luxury object or a symbol of childhood imagination yet. It was a tool. It helped people repair, patch, preserve, and stretch the life of things they could not easily replace. Before Testors taught children how to build tiny airplanes, it helped households hold together the objects already inside them. And to understand how an empire built on imagination, craftsmanship, and tiny painted airplanes ended in silence, you have to go back to the beginning. Back before the hobby shops. Before the model kits. Before the square bottles became icons of American childhood. Back to a small glue company in Rockford, Illinois, where none of this looked inevitable yet. The glue that started an empire. Long before the factory went quiet, before the paint racks emptied and the model aisle began to disappear from American life, the whole story rested on something small enough to fit in a kitchen drawer. A bottle of glue. That was the beginning. Not a grand headquarters. Not a national hobby empire. Not rows of enamel paints waiting under store lights. Just a practical adhesive in Rockford, Illinois, made for families who still believed broken things were worth saving. A loose shoe sole. A cracked toy. A school project coming apart the night before it was due. A piece of household life that needed one more chance before it was thrown away. In 1929, Nils F. Testor bought the assets of a small Rockford adhesive business, and with that modest decision, a name that would later sit on thousands of hobby shelves began its slow climb into American memory. At the time, it did not look historic. It looked ordinary. A Swedish immigrant stepping into a small trade, selling a product that had to prove itself the hard way, by working when people needed it. That mattered more than it sounds. America was moving into hard, yeah, that was the first trust. The early Testors product ours. Families watched their money closely. Waste carried a different meaning. A bottle of glue was not a luxury object or a symbol of childhood imagination yet. It was a tool. It helped people repair, patch, preserve, and stretch the life of things they could not easily replace. Before Testors taught children how to build tiny airplanes, it helped households hold together the objects already inside them. That idea would later become the emotional center of the Testors empire. For now, it lived in smaller scenes. A parent leaning over a kitchen table. A child pressing two pieces together and waiting for the bond to hold. The sharp smell of adhesive in the air. A label on a bottle that promised usefulness without ceremony. There was no national mythology yet, only the everyday satisfaction of seeing something stay in place. Yet those small scenes were already pointing toward the future. The same product that repaired ordinary household objects began appearing near craft materials, school projects, balsa wood, and early model parts. Builders needed glue that could do more than mend. They needed control. They needed a clean bond. They needed a product that made fragile pieces feel manageable. Testors had entered the home as a repair tool, but the hands using it were beginning to ask for something more precise. That is where the story started to turn. A company does not become part of a national pastime simply by selling supplies. It becomes part of the ritual. The cap twisting open. The careful squeeze. The two pieces held together longer than a child wants to wait. The small disappointment when a joint fails. The quiet pride when it finally holds. These were not dramatic moments, yet they trained the same qualities that model building would later demand: patience, attention, and the willingness to try again. Testors did not invent that instinct. It found a way to serve it. The deeper power of the early company was not only the glue itself. It was the promise attached to it. If something came apart, you did not have to accept the damage. If an object was incomplete, you could help finish it. If the pieces were small enough and your hands were steady enough, you could make them stay together. That promise was practical at first, almost invisible. Later, it would become emotional. Because every model empire begins with a belief in pieces. Pieces in a box. Pieces on a table. Pieces that look useless until somebody gives them order. Testors began before the airplane kits and before the famous paint bottles, but its earliest product already belonged to that world. It taught people that making was not magic. It was pressure, timing, patience, and trust. For a while, that was enough. A small company in Rockford had no way of knowing that its adhesive would one day sit beside tiny wings, plastic fuselages, camouflage colors, and instruction sheets studied like maps. It could not yet see the hobby shops, the model clubs, the children memorizing aircraft names, or the factory whose silence would one day feel like the end of something larger than a business. Still, the foundation had been laid. Testors had entered American life through repair. Soon, it would move into craft. The same bottle that helped hold ordinary things together was about to become a passport into miniature machines, aviation dreams, and a slower kind of childhood built one careful joint at a time. When repair became craft, the glue had already earned its place in American homes. The harder test was waiting in smaller pieces. A shoe sole could hide an imperfect bond. A cracked toy could survive a little excess glue. A school project could lean slightly and still pass for finished. A model airplane was less forgiving. A heavy scene could throw off the balance. A warped wing could ruin the shape before it ever left the table. Too much adhesive could turn a clean line into a scar. That was where Testors began to change. The company had started with repair, with the plain promise that broken things did not have to stay broken. Yet the growing world of model building asked for something more exact. These builders were not simply mending household objects. They were trying to turn scattered parts into miniature machines, and every piece carried a demand for patience. Thin balsa strips, paper plans, tiny ribs, sanded edges, fuselages so light they could be damaged by the same hand trying to finish them. In the middle of the 1930s, model aviation was moving deeper into American imagination. Flight no longer felt distant. Newspapers carried records, air races, daring pilots, and machines that seemed to belong to the future more than the ground. Children looked at airplanes differently. They were not only things passing overhead. They were shapes to study, names to memorize, and dreams to rebuild in miniature on a table covered with newspaper. That changed what a bottle of glue had to mean. The hobbyist did not only ask whether it would hold. He wanted to know how cleanly it dried, how fast it set, whether it would stain the wood, whether it could handle sanding, paint, handling, and the tension of a carefully built airframe. A model did not simply need strength. It needed control. The joint had to disappear so the work could show. Testors moved toward that need with model cement and finishing products, stepping beyond household usefulness into the more demanding language of craft. By the mid-1930s, the company was no longer only selling a general adhesive. It was beginning to serve builders who judged a product by what happened after the cap came off, after the brush touched the wood, after the pieces were pressed together, and the waiting began. That was a quieter kind of authority. A mass product earns recognition by being everywhere. A hobby product earns loyalty by behaving the same way every time it is needed. Inside the model world, one bad bond could waste an evening. One cloudy finish could bury hours of careful sanding. One wrong formula could make a fragile airplane heavier, weaker, or less true to the thing it was meant to represent. So the bottle moved into a different place on the table. It sat beside folded instructions, hobby knives, small brushes, scraps of balsa, and parts arranged with the seriousness of a surgeon laying out tools. The smell was sharper. The purpose narrower. The work felt less like fixing and more like learning how precision behaved under pressure. Model building turned ordinary rooms into workshops. A kitchen table became a miniature hangar. A basement bench became an engineering desk. A bedroom corner became a place where a child could study a wing angle without knowing the word aerodynamics. Testors entered those rooms not as decoration, but as one of the tools that made the ritual possible. The ritual mattered as much as the product. The box opened. The plans unfolded. The builder looked from paper to parts and back again, trying to imagine the finished aircraft before the first joint was made. Glue touched wood in a thin line. Fingers held the pieces together longer than patience wanted. The model rested under a small weight while the builder waited, resisting the urge to test the bond too soon. That waiting taught its own lesson. It taught that making something real could not be rushed without cost. It taught that imagination needed discipline. It taught that a mistake was not the end of the project, only another problem to solve. Testors became attached to that lesson because its products lived exactly where the dream met the hand. The airplane in the mind could be perfect. The airplane on the table had to be earned. That is what separated craft from simple play. A toy arrived complete. A model arrived as a promise. Nothing flew, stood, or looked right until someone gave it time. The builder had to learn the order of assembly, the pressure of the fingers, the patience of drying, the danger of using too much, the satisfaction of using just enough. Testors was becoming part of that education, one seam at a time. The company's early credibility gave it a powerful advantage. Parents already knew the name. Stores already knew the product. Children already saw the bottle as familiar, not mysterious. That familiarity helped Testors cross from the household drawer into the hobby box without feeling like a stranger. The same brand that had helped mend ordinary things could now help build extraordinary ones. Across the country, that shift gave the company a different emotional place in American life. It was no longer only there after something broke. It was there before something existed. Before the wings joined. Before the paint dried. Before the tiny aircraft took shape. Before a child stepped back from the table and saw, for the first time, that a pile of parts could become a machine. That moment carried more weight than the sales figures could show. Because the future Testors' empire would not be built only on glue, paint, or kits. It would be built on confidence. Confidence that the product would behave. Confidence that the instructions could be followed. Confidence that careful hands could turn small pieces into something worth keeping. The company was learning to sell more than adhesion. It was selling the possibility that patience could become visible. Still, the strength hidden inside that ritual carried a shadow. Model building required time. It required focus. It required a world willing to let children sit with a project long enough to fail, correct, and finish. In these early years, that world still existed. The table was still available. The hobby shop still had room to grow. The culture still had space for slow work and small triumphs. For Testors, that made the future look open. The little bottle had crossed the threshold. It had moved from repair into craft, from usefulness into precision, from the drawer into the workshop. A small Rockford adhesive company was beginning to speak the language of serious builders, and that language would soon carry it far beyond ordinary household repair. History, though, was about to make the model airplane mean something heavier. The same tiny aircraft that taught children patience would soon be studied for recognition, training, and wartime imagination. Materials would tighten. Production would strain. A factory built around glue, paint, and careful work would face forces far larger than the hobby itself. Before Testors could reach its golden age, it would have to survive war, shortage, and fire. If this story brings back the smell of paint, glue, and unfinished projects on an old kitchen table, take a moment to like the video, subscribe for more stories, and share your own memories below. The smallest hobbies often leave the deepest marks after the shelves and factories fade away. Tested by war and fire. The model airplane stopped being only a child's dream when the real airplanes began deciding the fate of nations. On quiet tables, the ritual still looked familiar. A plan unfolded. A wing took shape. A fuselage rested under careful hands. Yet the world outside those rooms had changed. Flight was no longer just wonder, speed, or modern imagination. It had become strategy, recognition, training, survival. The same miniature aircraft that once taught patience could now teach a sharper kind of seeing. War gave the hobby a harder purpose. During the World War II years, model aircraft became more than leisure objects. Static scale models were used for training and aircraft recognition, helping pilots, gunners, mechanics, and observers learn the shape of machines they might one day need to identify quickly. A wing angle was no longer just a design detail. A tail profile was no longer just something a careful builder wanted to get right. In wartime, shape could carry consequence. That shift pulled Testors into a wider national pressure. The company had already moved from household glue into model cement and finishing products. It already understood that small details mattered. War made those details feel heavier. Accuracy, bonding, materials, and supply were no longer just features of a growing hobby market. They belonged to a country measuring every product against urgency. Inside Rockford, the factory would have carried the sharp industrial language of that moment. Solvents in the air. Containers stacked for shipment. Workers moving through routines made tighter by shortage and demand. The company was still small compared with the giants of wartime production, but the pressure reached even here. Adhesives, paints, packaging, wood, plastic, chemicals, and shipping all depended on supply chains strained by a nation at war. Nothing about the old rhythm could be taken for granted. Materials tightened. Civilian production faced limits. Familiar products became harder to keep flowing. A company built on glue, paint, and hobby supplies had to work inside a system where every ingredient had a competing purpose and every delay could travel down the line. Testors was no longer simply asking whether hobbyists wanted its products. It had to ask whether the industrial world around it could still provide what those products required. That is where the company's earlier discipline began to matter. A brand that had learned to serve careful builders already understood consistency. It knew that a bad bond could ruin hours of work, that a weak finish could damage trust, that precision was not decoration. War did not create that discipline, but it gave it a new frame. The skills of the hobby table were suddenly connected to the demands of a country under stress. The miniature aircraft became a strange bridge between childhood and conflict. In one room, a boy might still build because he loved airplanes. In another, a model might be studied for recognition and training. The object was small in both places, but the meaning had changed. The hobby had touched history, and Testors stood near the center of that contact point. Then, in 1944, the pressure became physical. A fire struck the Rockford facility and badly damaged the operation. For a company built around adhesives, paints, solvents, and careful mixtures, fire was not just an accident. It was the nightmare hidden inside the materials themselves. Heat found the places where the business was most vulnerable. Shelves, stock, tools, records, labels, workspaces, and the familiar order of the plant could be damaged in hours. A factory is more than a building. It is a map of memory. Workers know where to stand, where to reach, which path to take, which sound belongs and which one means trouble. Fire destroys that silent knowledge along with the visible inventory. It turns routine into debris. For Testors, the timing made the blow harsher. Wartime America already demanded adaptation. Materials were already under pressure. The company was already balancing usefulness, shortage, and expectation. The fire did not arrive in a calm season. It came when continuity mattered most. The image still cuts through the story. Before the later abandonment. Before the empty rooms and dust-covered remnants. Before the old factory could become a symbol of a vanished hobby world, flames had already offered an earlier version of erasure. There was heat before silence. There was damage before memory. There was a moment when the Rockford operation could have become a footnote instead of a foundation. It did not. Testors rebuilt after the fire, and the recovery changed the meaning of the company's future. Survival alone would have been enough to prove endurance. Rebuilding meant something larger. It meant the company still believed demand was waiting beyond the damage. It meant the people around the business saw more than ash and interruption. They saw a road forward. That kind of recovery does not happen by accident. It requires workers willing to return to a place that has already shown them how fragile it is. It requires leadership willing to treat disaster not only as loss, but as a chance to strengthen the ground beneath the company. It requires customers retailers, and builders who still expect the name to come back. The fire had threatened the physical body of Testors. The response hardened its identity. What emerged from that period was not merely the same small adhesive company patched back together. Testors had been tested by war, strained by material limits, and struck by fire. It had moved through three kinds of pressure: national urgency, industrial shortage, and physical destruction. Each one could have narrowed the company. Instead, each one made the brand feel more durable. That durability mattered because post-war America was about to change the scale of the opportunity. Families wanted peace to feel tangible. Children who had grown up under the shadow of war still looked to the sky with fascination. Aircraft carried memory, technology, heroism, and possibility. A model airplane could now mean many things at once: a toy, a lesson, a tribute, a technical challenge, a piece of history small enough to finish by hand. Testors was positioned for that moment because it had already earned trust in the hard years. It had the glue. It had the cement. It had the paints. It had the rebuilt base and the reputation to move deeper into a culture that was about to make model building part of everyday American childhood. The company had survived pressure. Opportunity was beginning to open. The fire could have reduced Testors to ash before its greatest years arrived. Instead, it left the company standing at the edge of a post-war world ready for hobbies, homes, kits, colors, and careful hands. The factory had been damaged. The ritual had not. Soon, the little bottles would move from survival into abundance, and the quiet craft of model building would become one of the most recognizable fixtures of American workbenches. The little bottle on every workbench. After the fire, Testors did not return to a smaller world. It returned to an America ready to build again. The war had made aircraft serious. Peace made them personal. Across the country, children who had heard the names of fighters, bombers, pilots, and distant airfields began finding those machines reduced to wings, decals, clear canopies, landing gear, and folded instruction sheets. The sky had become history. The model kit made that history small enough to hold. Testors was waiting for that moment. The company had survived pressure, shortage, and fire with its name intact. The rebuilt operation gave it a stronger base just as American homes were filling with post-war confidence, spare time rituals, and affordable objects that made ordinary life feel expansive again. Model building moved out of the margins and into the open. It appeared in hobby shops, department stores, hardware aisles, dime store counters, basements, garages, classrooms, and kitchen tables protected by old newspaper. The little square bottle became part of that landscape. For many families, it was a simple object. A glass bottle. A metal cap. A label. A color name printed small enough that the builder had to lean close. Yet the moment it opened, the room changed. The sharp smell of enamel entered first. A brush dipped into color. A hand steadied the fuselage. A pale plastic wing waited for its first coat. The object on the table was still unfinished, but the ritual had begun. That ritual was the real empire. Testors was not only selling paint and cement. It was selling the tools that allowed imagination to become physical. A kit arrived as possibility, but it did nothing on its own. The builder had to cut, test, trim, glue, weight, sand, paint, touch up, and try again when the first attempt showed every mistake. The work asked for patience. The bottle sat there as both helper and judge. Paint did not forgive carelessness. Glue did not reward impatience. A fingerprint could scar a wing. A rush coat could swallow detail. A crooked decal could turn a promising build into a lesson in humility. That was part of the attraction. A finished model meant something because it had resisted being finished badly. For children, that resistance became a kind of education. A model airplane taught sequence without calling it discipline. It taught measurement without sounding like school. It taught history through shape, color, and name. A child could learn what a Mustang looked like, what camouflage meant, why a bomber had certain lines, why a jet seemed to belong to a faster century. Knowledge entered through the hands first. Inside homes, Testors lived in moments that seemed small until they became memory. A parent steadying a wing. A sibling reaching for the wrong color. A child blowing gently on wet paint that needed more time. A warning not to spill anything on the table. The faint ring left by a bottle on newspaper. The slow pride of placing the finished model on a shelf where everyone could see it, at least until dust began to settle on the wings. Hobby shops gave that private ritual a public world. The best of those shops had their own atmosphere. Glass cases holding finished builds. Pegboard walls lined with kits. Paint racks arranged like coded maps. The smell of cardboard, enamel, balsa, and old catalogs. Quiet conversations about seams, finishes, engines, ships, cars, and aircraft. A child could walk in with folded bills and leave with an entire weekend in a paper bag. Testors belonged naturally in that world. Rows of bottles stood near the counter, carrying colors that were more than decoration. Military grays. Gloss blacks. Flat whites. Bright reds. Olive drabs. Silvers that made aircraft feel fast even before the first part was assembled. To outsiders, the rack looked like supplies. To builders, it looked like permission. The hobby shop was not just retail. It was a place where the culture taught itself how to continue. Advice moved across the counter. Older builders warned beginners about using too much glue. Store owners knew which kits frustrated first-timers and which ones could turn a casual buyer into a lifelong modeler. Finished planes hanging overhead became proof that patients could leave the table and enter the room. This was where Testors grew from a familiar product into a shared language. A builder might buy a kit from one company and decals from another, but the final moment often came back to Testors. The cement joined the pieces. The enamel gave the machine its skin. The finishing work turned plastic, wood, or metal into something that looked older, faster, heavier, or more real than it had any right to look. Testors lived at the intimate stage of the build, where the objects stopped being parts and started becoming personal. That gave the brand a quiet kind of dominance. It did not always need to be the largest box on the shelf. It only needed to be the thing builders reached for before the work could be finished. That is a different form of power. Less flashy, but more deeply embedded. The kit might carry the subject. Testors carried the transformation. As the hobby expanded, the company's reach widened with it. Aircraft remained central, yet model building spread across cars, ships, military vehicles, rockets, engines, and machines that reflected an America fascinated by speed, design, war memory, technology, and the future. Paint and cement could follow all of it. Wherever there were parts to join and surfaces to finish, Testors had a place. That flexibility made the company feel secure. A beginner could start with a simple kit and a few basic colors. A serious builder could chase more accurate finishes, cleaner seams, and more demanding projects. The same brand could follow a person from a first clumsy airplane to shelves filled with work that looked less like play and more like craft. At its strongest, Testors was not merely a company inside the hobby. It was part of the hobby's physical memory. The bottle cap stuck slightly. The label wore down. The enamel thickened if it sat too long. Brushes hardened when someone forgot to clean them. The work left marks on hands, tables, clothes, and shelves. That mess was part of the truth. Making something real rarely stayed clean. For a generation, the little square bottle became one of the quiet symbols of American making. Not industrial production. Personal making. The kind that happened after dinner, during rainy weekends, in basement corners, at kitchen tables, and in spare rooms where time could slow down long enough for a child to become absorbed in a project that would not finish itself. That was the height of the world Testors helped create. It was accessible. It was affordable enough for families to recognize. It was serious enough for hobbyists to respect. It connected children to history, parents to children, shops to communities, and small objects to large machines. The company's strength came not only from the product, but from the culture surrounding it. At the peak, that culture seemed almost self-renewing. There would always be another kit. Another bottle. Another color. Another aircraft to build. Another child willing to sit at the table and wait for glue to dry. Another hobby shop with advice behind the counter, and paint racks waiting under fluorescent light. The confidence was understandable. It was also the first illusion. Because Testors' power was never sealed inside the bottle alone. It depended on everything around it: stores that kept the racks full, families that made room for slow projects, children willing to learn through mistakes, and a culture that still believed patience was part of play. At the height of the empire, all of those supports looked solid. That was exactly why the first cracks were so easy to miss. The first cracks were cultural. At first, nothing looked broken. That was the danger. The bottles were still there. The racks still held familiar colors. The kits still waited in boxes with aircraft, cars, ships, and machines printed across the front like promises. A child could still walk into a shop, choose a project, carry it home, and spread the parts across a table. From a distance, the world Testors depended on still looked alive. Up close, the rhythm was changing. The weakness did not begin as a dramatic corporate failure. It began inside ordinary habits. Model building required time, space, patience, and a willingness to sit with a project before it gave anything back. It asked a child to wait while glue dried, to accept a crooked seam, to sand down a mistake, to repaint a surface, to follow instructions when the easier choice was to walk away. For decades, that kind of slowness had felt normal, even valuable. Then faster things began crowding the room. Television grew louder. Toy aisles became more immediate. Electronic games arrived with light, movement, sound, and reward built into the first second. Later, screens would become smaller, brighter, and impossible to ignore. A model kit still asked the buyer to imagine the finished object before it existed. New entertainment showed the thrill instantly. One world demanded patience. The other delivered reaction. That was not a small difference. Testors had built its meaning inside delayed satisfaction. The pleasure came after the cutting, after the glue, after the drying time, after the paint, after the mistakes had been hidden or repaired. The work itself was part of the reward. A culture moving faster does not always reject that kind of work loudly. Often, it simply stops making room for it. The first things to weaken were not always the products. They were the rituals around the products. A kitchen table that once stayed covered with newspaper for an entire weekend had to compete with television, sports practice, malls, arcades, game consoles, and eventually digital worlds that require no cleanup at all. A child who once studied an instruction sheet could now enter motion, color, and reward without waiting for enamel to dry. A hobby that left fingerprints, fumes, scraps, and unfinished parts began competing against entertainment that vanished cleanly when the screen went dark. The hobby shop felt that shift early. Those shops had once been the living network around Testors. They explained the colors. They recommended the glue. They warned beginners about mistakes before they ruined the build. They kept the culture visible, social, and alive. When footsteps slowed in those aisles, the loss was not only retail traffic. It was the sound of a world losing its own recruiting ground. A paint rack can survive on loyalty for a while. A hobby cannot survive forever without new hands. That was the hidden weakness beneath Testors' peak. The company's strength came from a system that kept producing builders. Parents who remembered the smell of enamel. Children willing to try. Stores willing to stock slow-moving colors. Magazines, clubs, contests, and counter conversations that turned a product into a culture. Remove one piece, and the system could still stand. Remove enough of them, and the whole structure began to lean. The danger was easy to miss because the brand still had recognition. The name still meant something. The square bottle still carried memory. Serious modelers still cared about finish, accuracy, and technique. Older hobbyists still trusted what they had always reached for. From inside the culture, loyalty could feel like protection. It was not protection. It was inheritance. A brand can live for years on memory while the future quietly stops arriving. Testors did not need every old builder to leave. It only needed fewer new builders to enter. Fewer children asking for kits. Fewer parents tolerating the mess. Fewer stores giving space to colors that did not turn over quickly. Fewer afternoons where making something slowly seemed more exciting than pressing a button and being rewarded immediately. Decline entered through ordinary choices. One family skipped the kit aisle. One local shop reduced its model section. One retailer gave more room to faster-selling toys. One child chose a game instead of a plane. One paint color sold too slowly to justify its place. None of those moments looked historic by itself. Together, they changed the ground beneath the company. Pressure also came from outside the culture. Competition intensified. Retail changed. Production costs mattered more when demand became less predictable. A brand built around paints, glues, specialty finishes, and model supplies had to serve loyal hobbyists while adapting to a market that no longer moved with the old confidence. The creative legacy remained. The business underneath it was becoming harder to defend. That is where the deeper fracture opened. Testors' model empire ended as shifting consumer interests, rising production pressures, and intensified competition drained its dominance. Once beloved for hobby paints and model kits, the company struggled to stay profitable while adapting to a changing market where new toys and electronics grabbed attention faster. The old world did not vanish because it had no value. That is what makes the loss heavier. Model building still taught patience. It still rewarded careful hands. It still connected children to machines, history, design, and practical problem solving. A finished model still carried the proof of time spent well. The problem was that value and demand are not the same thing. A culture can preserve meaning and still lose momentum. A product can remain useful while the world around it stops needing it in the same way. For testers, the old strengths began turning into burdens. A wide paint range depends on enough people caring about exact shades. Specialty finishes depend on enough builders chasing detail. Hobby cement depends on enough kits being opened, enough parts being joined, enough workbenches staying active. When the audience narrows, detail becomes expensive. When shops close, discovery becomes harder. When children stop entering young, the future becomes older before anyone admits it. The bottle still worked. The glue still held. The paint still dried. The labels still carried memory. The world around them was no longer holding as firmly. That was the strange cruelty of cultural decline. Nothing had to be wrong with the object itself. The danger lived outside it, in shrinking aisles, changing childhoods, faster entertainment, tighter retail decisions, and a marketplace asking whether patience could still justify shelf space. Testors had built an empire around hands willing to slow down. The culture was beginning to reward everything that moved faster. At the height of its power, people had assumed there would always be another builder, another kit, another shop, another rack of paint under fluorescent light, another child leaning over a table, waiting for a wing to dry. By the time the cracks became visible, that assumption had already begun to fail. The first signs did not sound like collapse. They sounded like fewer footsteps in the hobby shop aisle, fewer bottles turning over on the rack, fewer children willing to wait, and a market quietly preparing to make the old world smaller. Stories like this disappear quietly unless people keep remembering them. If this journey through Testors' decline meant something to you, like the video, subscribe for more documentary histories, and leave a comment about the hobbies, stores, or workbenches you remember. Sometimes memory is the last thing holding vanished worlds together. The empire shrinks one color at a time. The culture changed first. The shelves answered later. At first, decline did not announce itself like collapse. It looked smaller than that. A slower order. A thinner rack. A color that did not sell fast enough. A retailer asking whether so many bottles still deserved the same space. The old world had already begun to weaken in homes and hobby shops. The business consequences arrived afterward, colder and harder to argue with. A hobby can survive on memory for a long time. A business cannot. Testors still carried weight. The name still meant glue on fingertips, enamel in the air, and unfinished kits drying under a desk lamp. Older builders still knew what the bottles represented. Serious modelers still cared about finish, accuracy, and control. Parents still remembered the smell before they remembered the label. Recognition remained. Loyalty remained. Yet loyalty did not solve the arithmetic beneath the rack. A wide hobby line needs movement. It needs enough builders buying enough colors, enough cement, enough thinner, enough specialty finishes, enough replacement bottles, enough new projects to keep the system alive. Each shade has a cost before it ever reaches a workbench. Pigments, solvents, caps, labels, glass or plastic containers, packaging, shipping, storage, retail placement. When the hobby is growing, that complexity looks like abundance. The very detail that made Testors powerful began to make it vulnerable. A modeler saw range. A company saw inventory. A builder saw the perfect military gray, the right gloss black, the shade that made an aircraft look correct under a thin coat of light. A corporate ledger saw production runs, margins, supply chains, slow sellers, and shelf space that had to justify itself. The bottle had not changed. The conditions around it had. As Testors moved deeper into larger corporate ownership, the atmosphere around the brand grew less personal. It was no longer only a Rockford story about adhesives, paint, workbenches, and model builders. It became part of a wider portfolio, measured beside other consumer products, asked to perform inside a business logic that cared less about memory and more about efficiency. The brand survived, but survival inside a portfolio is not the same thing as standing at the center of a culture. A corporation looks at a paint rack differently than a hobbyist does. To a builder, a discontinued color can feel like a missing word in a language learned over years. To a company, it may be a product that no longer earns its place. To a hobby shop, it becomes an empty slot and an uncomfortable conversation. Someone walks in asking for a familiar bottle. The owner checks the shelf, then the catalog, then the supplier. The answer gets shorter each time. It is gone. That kind of loss lands quietly, which is why it can cut deeper. There is no ceremony for a product line that stops appearing. No factory whistle. No final television announcement. The disappearance is discovered by the people who still care enough to look for it. A builder reaches for the color that finished an old aircraft kit years earlier and finds the space changed, reduced, or filled with something else. Absence becomes the announcement. For loyal modelers, the narrowing felt personal because these products had never been only consumables. A bottle of paint could be tied to a first build, a father's old workbench, a club project, a shelf of unfinished kits, a technique learned through failure. Model Master, especially, carried that heavier meaning for builders who wanted more than basic color. It suggested accuracy, seriousness, and the belief that small details deserved respect. When beloved specialty lines became harder to find or disappeared altogether, the loss revealed how much the old world had depended on continuity. Builders did not just lose a product. They lost confidence that the ecosystem would still be there when the next project began. That confidence had once been part of the hobby's invisible foundation. The decline did not arrive through one clean break. It narrowed through decisions. A range simplified here. A line discontinued there. A shelf reduced. A store closed. A retailer shifted space toward products that moved faster. A hobbyist searched online for what used to be available around the corner. Each change could be explained. Each decision had its reason. Taken together, they formed a pattern no single explanation could soften. The empire was not exploding. It was contracting. That contraction made the old brand feel different. Testors could still exist. Testors could still sell. Testors could still appear in stores and online. Yet the surrounding world that once gave the brand its force was no longer as deep, as visible, or as self-renewing. A logo can remain after the culture that made it powerful has thinned out. A bottle can survive after the empire around it has become memory. That is the wound at the center of the story. For decades, Testors had not merely supplied modelers. It had helped organize a physical hobby ecosystem: shops, paint racks, kits, clubs, magazines, workbenches, parents, children, and serious builders connected through the small tools of making. As that ecosystem weakened, the company remained present in a narrower way. It was no longer expanding outward through discovery. It was defending a smaller inheritance. The business pressures kept tightening because cultural decline had become economic reality. Fewer new builders meant weaker demand. Fewer hobby shops meant fewer places for discovery. Faster entertainment meant fewer young hands entering the craft. Competition intensified around the customers who remained. Production costs did not disappear just because the audience became smaller. They pressed harder. The old promise had been abundance. The new reality was calculation. Every specialty product had to prove itself. Every paint range had to justify the cost of staying alive. Every slow seller carried the risk of becoming dead weight. The same complexity that once made Testors feel complete now made the brand harder to carry in full. The more the market shrank, the more the company had to trim. The more it trimmed, the more the old empire felt reduced. That is how creative legacies fade without one dramatic final blow. A store becomes a memory. A rack becomes thinner. A child becomes a customer somewhere else. A builder grows older. A company adapts, simplifies, protects what it can, and lets go of what the market will no longer support. No single choice tells the whole story. The accumulation does. There was still life in the hobby. There still is. Builders still work under lamps. Paint still dries on wings, tanks, ships, cars, figures, and fuselages. Careful hands still turn small parts into objects with weight and meaning. The loss is not that model building vanished completely. The loss is that the old Testors world no longer felt unavoidable. For a company once carried by visibility, that was a different kind of collapse. Not disappearance, but diminishment. Not silence all at once, but a volume turned down year after year until only the devoted could still hear what had been lost. By then, the old product lines were not simply shrinking. They were leaving evidence behind. Empty spaces on racks. Substitutions in drawers. Unfinished kits waiting for colors that no longer came easily. Online searches replacing visits to the local shop. The empire had been reduced color by color, shelf by shelf, until absence became the clearest sign of decline. The bottles that remained still carried memory. The memory could not rebuild the world around them. Soon, that loss would have a physical address. Rooms where work had once moved. Floors where shipments once passed. Industrial walls left behind after the culture that fed them had thinned away. The old factory would not explain everything by itself, but it would make the disappearance visible. Inside the abandoned factory. By the time the factory went quiet, the decline was no longer hidden in sales figures, discontinued colors, or shrinking hobby aisles. It had become a place. The old Rockford building carried the kind of silence only factories can hold. Not peaceful silence. Not the calm of an unused room. Industrial silence. The kind that feels heavier because the walls were built for movement, carts rolling, pallets shifting, bottles filling, caps tightening, boxes being sealed, workers calling across the floor, shipments leaving for stores where children and hobbyists would turn small supplies into small machines. That sound was gone. What remained was concrete, dust, peeling paint, old pipes, broken glass, and the strange afterlife of a company whose products once helped other people make things last. The rooms did not need to explain the whole story. They simply held the residue. A floor where work once moved. Inside a ruin like that, absence becomes physical. A discontinued product can be debated. A narrowed paint line can be explained. A closed hobby shop can become a memory told by the people who once walked through it. An abandoned factory does something colder. It forces the loss into space. It gives decline walls, floors, corners, and shadows. It lets the viewer feel that a living system once needed this place, then no longer did. That is why the building matters. For decades, Testors had been connected to motion. Bottles moved through production. Paint traveled into stores. Cement left Rockford for hobby benches across the country. Kits were opened, pieces joined, colors chosen, shelves stocked, orders filled. The factory belonged to a chain of hands. Workers made the supplies. Retailers placed them within reach. Builders carried them home. A child opened the cap and entered the chain without knowing it. The abandoned building breaks that chain in the mind. Where there should be stock, there is emptiness. Where there should be routine, there is dust. Where there should be chemical sharpness and machine rhythm, there is stale air. The factory becomes a negative image of the empire, defined less by what remains than by what can no longer happen there. Industrial ruins have that cruel power. They make business decline visible in a way numbers rarely can. A sales chart can show contraction. A corporate announcement can explain simplification. A discontinued line can anger loyal customers. A place like this does something deeper. It turns decline into a walkable fact. It says the old system was not an idea. It required rooms, workers, materials, freight, shelves, buyers, habits, and demand strong enough to keep everything moving. Once that demand thinned, the rooms lost their reason. The answer was not hidden in one doorway or one broken window. It lived in everything that came before: the fading hobby shops, the faster toys, the screens, the changing childhoods, the pressure on product lines, the corporate logic that could preserve a brand while narrowing the world around it. Testors did not fade because the little bottle stopped meaning something. It faded because meaning alone could not keep the old ecosystem alive. The factory exposes that difference. Memory can remain powerful while the structure that carried it disappears. Former builders can still remember the first time enamel touched a wing. Collectors can still search for old bottles, old kits, old labels, and colors that no longer sit where they once did. Hobbyists can still talk about finishes they trusted and projects completed under desk lamps. Yet memory does not fill pallets. It does not reopen counters. It does not bring back the foot traffic of a local shop on a Saturday morning. The old rooms understand that better than nostalgia does. They stand as proof that a creative legacy can lose scale without losing emotional value. Testors helped generations build with their hands. It turned glue and paint into tools of patience, accuracy, and imagination. It belonged to a world where children could learn the shape of aircraft, cars, ships, and machines not by scrolling past them, but by assembling them one piece at a time. The silence makes that loss sharper. Because this was never only about paint. It was about the culture that made paint matter. The shelves that held it. The stores that explained it. The parents who bought it. The children who spilled it. The hobbyists who mastered it. The rooms where unfinished models waited for the final coat. When those places weakened, the product lost more than sales. It lost its natural habitat. That is what the abandoned factory reveals. The decline of Testors was not only corporate contraction. It was the physical ending of a certain kind of confidence, the belief that there would always be more builders, more shops, more patient weekends, more colors worth making, more hands willing to turn small pieces into proof of skill. Once that confidence failed, the factory became less like a production center and more like a monument to a culture that moved on without pausing to mark the loss. A walk through a place like that makes the imagination do the work time has stopped doing. The mind starts putting the sound back. The clatter of carts. The scrape of boxes. The dull shine of floors worn by repetition. The label colors. The solvent air. The ordinary human details that rarely enter company histories. Lunch breaks, tired hands, late orders, jokes across the line, workers leaving at the end of a shift without knowing which routines would one day disappear completely. Factories carry more than output. They carry habits. They carry labor. They carry the daily proof that a product has a world behind it. For Testors, that world stretched from Rockford to the local hobby shop, from the shop to the kitchen table, from the table to the shelf where a finished model sat as a small private victory. The abandoned building cuts into the memory because it reminds us that every object on a shelf came from somewhere. Every bottle had a source. Every childhood ritual had an industrial body behind it. When that body is left behind, the ritual changes meaning. The little square bottle becomes more than a supply. It becomes an artifact. The old paint rack becomes more than retail. It becomes evidence of a time when making things slowly still had enough force to support factories, stores, clubs, magazines, and a whole vocabulary of craft. The abandoned site pulls that entire loss into one image. Creativity once organized enough demand to fill rooms with work. Then the demand moved, thinned, and scattered. Nothing about that is simple. Testors did not vanish completely. Model building did not die completely. There are still builders, still kits, still careful hands, still people who understand why the old smell of enamel can bring back an entire room. The loss is more precise than disappearance. It is the loss of scale. The loss of certainty. The loss of a world where testors felt less like a niche memory and more like a normal part of growing up around tools, models, and patient work. That is why the factory matters. It keeps the story from becoming a vague complaint about changing times. It shows that the shift from hands-on creation to faster entertainment did not only change childhood. It changed stores, supply chains, factories, jobs, rooms, shelves, and the physical places where creative industries once lived. Inside the abandoned factory, the silence shows how quickly a creative American legacy can fade when demand disappears and the business cannot reinvent fast enough. The line is hard because the evidence is concrete. A company that once helped people build miniature worlds by hand left behind a real world of its own: walls, floors, pipes, rooms, and empty space. The old workbenches in American homes may have disappeared quietly. The hobby shops may have closed one by one. The paint lines may have narrowed without ceremony. Here, the accumulated loss finally becomes visible. The empty building shows what disappeared. The harder question is what that disappearance means. What we lost when the tables went quiet. The factory can show what disappeared. It cannot, by itself, explain why the loss still matters. That answer lives in the space between the empty rooms and the old workbenches. Testors still exists as a name. Model building still exists as a craft. Careful hands still assemble aircraft, cars, ships, tanks, figures, and machines under desk lamps. The story is not that everything vanished. The story is that a whole world lost scale. That distinction matters. A hobby can survive in smaller circles and still lose the broad cultural place it once held. A brand can continue and still no longer feel like the center of a national ritual. A bottle can remain useful while the world that made it ordinary becomes rare. Testors did not only lose market power. It lost the surrounding culture that once made its products feel inevitable. That is the deeper meaning of the little square bottle. It belonged to an age when making something by hand was not treated as a niche act. It was a normal part of childhood. A child could buy a kit, sit at a table, make mistakes, get frustrated, wait too long or not long enough, and slowly learn that skill was built through correction. The process asked for patience before it gave back pride. Patience was the hidden material in every box. The glue mattered. The paint mattered. The plastic, wood, decals, and instructions mattered. Yet the real product was the discipline formed by the work. Model building taught that small things could require serious attention. It taught that history could be studied through shape and color. It taught that a machine was not only something to admire from a distance, but something to understand through pieces, sequence, and structure. That kind of learning is quiet, which is one reason it disappears quietly. No one announces the end of a household habit. There is no ceremony when a kitchen table stops being covered with newspaper. No headline marks the last time a child learns the smell of enamel, or the last time a parent warns that a wing needs to dry before the next step. The absence spreads through ordinary life until the old ritual feels like something from another country. Testors' decline makes that absence visible because the company was tied so closely to the ritual. It did not sell a finished toy. It sold the materials of becoming. The object was incomplete until the builder entered the process. That gave the hobby dignity. It also made the business vulnerable to a culture that increasingly favored speed, convenience, and instant reward. There is no need to romanticize the past to recognize the loss. Model building could be messy. The fumes were real. The mistakes were frustrating. The results were not always beautiful. Many projects were abandoned half-finished, left in boxes, or quietly discarded after broken landing gear or a ruined paint coat. Yet even those failures taught something. They reminded the builder that imagination without patience could only go so far. That lesson became harder to sell in a faster world. The shift away from Testors' old empire was not only a change in products. It was a change in rhythm. The old hobby asked people to slow down. The new marketplace rewarded speed. The old workbench accepted mistakes as part of learning. Newer forms of entertainment often hid the mess entirely. The model kit required a person to make the object real. The screen made the object appear already complete. That change reached beyond one company. It touched hobby shops, clubs, family routines, magazines, retail aisles, factory floors, supply chains, and the small social worlds that formed around making. When a hobby shop closed, a community lost more than a store. It lost a place where beginners could ask questions, where older builders could pass down technique, where a child could see finished models and understand that patience had a shape. A culture does not only depend on products. It depends on places that teach people how to value them. That is why the abandoned factory feels final. It is not just evidence that a business changed. It is evidence that a system once strong enough to support production, distribution, retail, and lifelong memory became smaller than the buildings built around it. The rooms were not abandoned because paint stopped drying or glue stopped holding. They were abandoned because demand, habit, and imagination had moved elsewhere. The hardest truth is that Testors was not defeated by uselessness. The products still had value. The craft still had meaning. The old builders still understood the appeal. The problem was that value alone could not preserve scale. A market has to be renewed by new people, new rituals, and new reasons to enter. When fewer children came in, when fewer stores carried the range, when fewer families made room for slow projects, the old empire had less future beneath it. That is how creative industries often fade. They do not always fail because the work becomes worthless. They fail because the world that once made the work central loses the habit of needing it. Music stores, camera shops, arcades, hobby counters, repair benches, local clubs, and craft aisles all carry versions of the same warning. The product may survive. The culture around it may not. Testors leaves that warning in miniature. Its story began with glue, the simplest symbol of repair. It grew through model cement, paint, kits, hobby shops, war pressure, fire, rebuilding, post-war abundance, and generations of careful hands. At its height, it helped turn aircraft history, mechanical imagination, and childhood patience into something physical. In decline, it showed how fragile that world becomes when the habits underneath it change. That is why the story matters beyond nostalgia. Nostalgia remembers the smell of enamel. Meaning asks what that smell represented. It represented time spent with the hand instead of the screen. It represented learning that did not announce itself as education. It represented the belief that a child could understand the world better by building a small piece of it. Failure became useful. Patience became visible. History became something that could sit on a shelf. The loss is not that every child must build models. The loss is that a culture once made room for that kind of slow, physical learning on a much larger scale. When that room shrank, something quieter than a factory closed. A way of paying attention became less common. That is the final weight of the Testors story. A small adhesive company in Rockford became a model empire because it understood how to help people join pieces together. Wood to wood. Plastic to plastic. Paint to surface. Child to craft. Hobbyist to history. Store to community. Factory to workbench. The tragedy is that the final pieces it could not hold together were the pieces of the world around it. The old bottle still carries the memory of what it once made possible. Somewhere, one still sits in a drawer, thickened with age. Somewhere, a half-finished kit waits in a box. Somewhere, a builder remembers the first model that failed, and the later one that finally did not. Those memories cannot rebuild the empire. They explain why its disappearance still hurts. Because some things vanish not when they stop working, but when the world stops making room for what they taught. In the end, the abandoned factory, the faded labels, the empty racks, and the quiet workbenches all point to the same unfinished lesson. Testors helped America build small things slowly. Then America changed speed. The abandoned Testors factory is more than an empty industrial building in Rockford. It is the physical outline of a world that once believed patience, precision, and careful hands still mattered enough to fill shelves, stores, and workbenches across America. The little bottles survived in drawers, toolboxes, and memory long after the culture around them began to fade. If this story brought back something you remember, take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and share your own memories in the comments. Sometimes the quietest industries leave behind the loudest absences. Because in the end, Testors did not just lose a market. America lost one more place where people learned to build slowly.